The death of the Ouroboros system was not an act of violence, but of artistry. There was no shriek of dying stars, no cataclysmic shockwave tearing through the void. There was only the final, silent note of a symphony of lies that had been composed over millennia. From the Empyrean, the Lord of Change known as Kairosphior, the Weaver of Parallax, conducted this grand finale. To mortal senses, a system of 6 worlds and a G-type star simply ceased to be. To the Weaver, it was the careful unspooling of a thread from the grand tapestry of reality, only to be rewoven into a pattern of exquisite and horrifying complexity. In the place where Ouroboros had been, a new and terrible jewel was set into the crown of the galaxy, the Labyrinth of All-Futures. Kairosphior perceived the event from every angle of time simultaneously. He saw the system's birth from a nebulous sigh, watched its planets cool, and witnessed the first primitive life crawl from its seas. He saw the arrival of human colony ships, the founding of the Forge world Anachrona upon its mineral-rich heart, and the millennia of faithful logical production in the name of a distant machine god. He saw its future, to 1,000 potential futures, one where it was consumed by a Tyranid splinter fleet, another where it fell to a Wa of unprecedented size, a third where its own Archmagos declared independence. He saw them all, and with a gesture of thought that rippled across the Sea of Souls, he declared them all to be true. The star Ouroboros did not die. It became 9 suns, each burning with an impossible color. A violet sun bathed the system in the light of ambition, while a sickly green sun illuminated it with the glow of decay. A brilliant silver sun shone with the pure light of innovation, and a crimson sun burned with the fires of violent revolution. These suns did not orbit in any logical fashion. They phased in and out of existence, their gravities warring, their light painting the newly born Daemon world in shifting, maddening hues. The planets were remade. Gas giants became swirling vortexes of crystallized screams. Barren rocks became thinking mountains that contemplated the nature of their own impossible existence. And Anachrona, the Forge world, the system's heart of logic and reason, became the labyrinth's core paradox. Its continent-spanning manufactorums now existed in every state at once. Gleaming new structures stood intertwined with rusted ruin. Production lines churned out pristine Skitarii legions, while in the very same space, those same assembly lines lay dormant and broken, buried under millennia of dust. On the streets of its forged cities, tech priests in immaculate robes walked past the decaying cybernetic corpses of their own future selves, while the ghosts of their unaugmented human ancestors screamed silent warnings that would never be heeded. Within this masterpiece of temporal blasphemy, the legions of the Changer of Ways began to bloom. Horrors of Tzeentch gibbered and danced through city squares that were both celebrating a new founding and mourning their final destruction. Flamers, living fonts of warp fire, soared through skies choked with the ash of wars that had happened and wars that were yet to be. Screamers, the sky sharks of the warp, hunted the temporal echoes of orbital freighters that had been dust for 10,000 years. And Kairosphior, their master and architect, settled his consciousness into the heart of it all, a being of infinite patience, waiting for the audience to arrive. The silence from the Ouroboros system was the first sign, a sector-wide communications hub that simply stopped reporting. Astropaths who reached out with their minds found not a void, but a wall of shimmering, contradictory noise, a psychic scream that was also a triumphant hymn. The Imperium, vast and slow, began to stir. A missing system was a catastrophe, a potential harbinger of a Xenos invasion or something far, far worse. It was the Adeptus Mechanicus of the nearby Ryza sector who responded first and with the greatest purpose. The Ouroboros system, and Anachrona in particular, had been a repository of priceless archaeotech, rumored to hold fragmented data from not one, but 3 distinct standard template constructs. Its loss was not just a strategic blow, it was a religious sacrilege, and so the Crusade of Pure Inquiry was mustered. It was a force of breathtaking power, a testament to the unyielding might of the machine god. At its head was the Archmagos, Logic's spire, a vessel so vast its spire-like command deck scraped the edges of the stratosphere of the worlds it orbited. It was a cathedral of computation, a fortress of holy machinery, commanded by Archmagos Veneratus Dristangent Ku Coriol, a being more machine than man, whose mind was considered one of the most brilliant instruments of logic in the entire segmentum. He was accompanied by a fleet of 30 cruisers and 100 escort frigates, their weapon bays filled with lances of coherent light and warheads capable of cracking continent. Within their holds traveled 3 full Skitarii legions, 2 entire households of Imperial Knights sworn to the Martian Creed, and a cohort of the Collegia Titanicas Legio Ferox. They were a hammer of pure cold reason, ready to smash whatever anomaly had dared to defy the quantifiable laws of the universe. As the Crusade fleet translated from the immaterium at the system's edge, Kairosphior felt their arrival like a chime of a bell. He watched from his throne at the center of time as their Geller fields collapsed and their mighty engines burned against the void. He saw the cold, analytical light of their augur arrays sweeping across his creation, their machine spirits desperately trying to make sense of the impossible sensor readings. Aboard the Logic Spire, binary cant screeched in alarm through the command deck's vox emitters. Tech priests recoiled from their cogitator screens, their optical sensors unable to resolve the data. The system was there, but it was also not there. The 9 suns were registered, but their energy outputs summed to a negative value. The planets were charted on orbital paths that intersected themselves. The chronomers, the most sacred and precise instruments on any Imperial vessel, began to spin backwards, then forwards, then both at once. A junior Magos reported sighting their own fleet, battle-scarred and broken, drifting out of the system, a warning of a battle they had not yet fought. Another reported the pristine sigils of their Crusade fleet just arriving, an echo of a past that was only seconds old. Archmagos Coriol stood immobile on his command dais, his multi-jointed metallic limbs locked in place. His organic brain, what little remained of it, felt a tremor of something his logic engines could not classify. It was not fear. Fear was an illogical emotional response. This was something else, a sublime sense of wrongness. He issued a string of binary commands, his voice a monotone buzz of pure information. Calibrate augurs, purge chronotors, re-verify stellar positioning. There is an error in the data. The data is always in error until proven otherwise. Impose logic. From his nexus of all pasts and all futures, Kairosphior watched the Archmagos and his fleet. He felt the cold, hard press of their logic against the beautiful, fluid chaos of his labyrinth. They were not invaders to be repelled. They were the key ingredient, the catalyst.
The experiment was about to begin.
The Weaver of Parallax focused a fraction of his consciousness and whispered a single, impossible idea into the core programming of the Logic Spire's primary cogitator. What if the error is not in the data, but in the logic itself? The command to impose logic echoed through the noosphere of the Crusade fleet, a clarion call of pure data against a universe gone mad. On the bridges of 30 cruisers and 100 escort craft, tech priests moved with the rigid certainty of their calling. Sacred oils were applied to overheating cogitators, and litanies of calibration were chanted in a low, resonant binary that was the machine voice of faith. They would force this patch of aberrant reality to conform to the Omnissiah's quantifiable truths, or they would render it down to its component data and write a new, correct equation upon its ashes. Waves of servitor probes, little more than a sensor package welded to a thruster, were launched in their thousands. They were the vanguard of reason, simple tools for a simple task: to see, to record, to report. The first wave's reports were the first testament to their failure. Probe Gamma Cherbex Hamshipsa transmitted a perfect high-fidelity image of its own hull being torn apart by micrometeoroids 3 seconds before its launch sequence was even initiated. Probe Delta Kubegir completed its entire survey pattern, mapping the gravitational anomalies of the 9 suns, and sent its full data slate back to the Logic Spire. A full minute after its launch bay servitors reported it had suffered a catastrophic engine failure and exploded on the launch rail. Hundreds more simply vanished, not with the energy signature of destruction, but with the chillingly clean signature of never having existed at all. A few returned, their hulls pitted and scarred not by the void, but by what their chronometers registered as centuries of exposure. One even returned with a crude glyph of a 9-pointed star scrawled on its casing in a substance later identified as the probe's own frozen, solidified lubricant. On the command dais of the Logic Spire, Archmagos Coriol processed the deluge of impossible data. His logic engine's word, overclocking to temperatures that would have melted the flesh of his long-dead predecessors. The contradictions were an assault, a dissonant symphony of falsehoods that threatened to overwhelm the pure logic of his consciousness. He watched on the main hololith as the grand ballet of his fleet began to stutter. The frigate Unflinching Axiom reported that it was taking evasive maneuvers to avoid a collision with itself. its own temporal echo on a course that had been plotted 10 minutes into its future. The cruiser, Syllogistic Fury, broadcasted a frantic astropathic message, its crew witnessing the spectral, silent explosions of their own vessel replaying around them like ghosts at a feast. Coriol raised a manipulator arm, the gesture silencing a rising tide of panicked cant from the attending Magi. Cease independent chronological verification, his voice buzzed, stripped of all inflection. All vessels will slave their temporal anchors to the master chronometer of the logic spire. We will provide the singular, authoritative timeline. All other temporal readings are to be considered data, demons, phantoms of the machine. They are illusions. We are the reality. It was a statement of breathtaking arrogance, an attempt to stare into the abyss of uncausality and declare it a miscalculation. Yet, for a moment, it seemed to work. The fleet tightened its formation, a brilliant spearhead of adamantium and faith aimed at the system's core. The phantom ships flickered and faded. The contradictory sensor readings were filtered into manageable noise. They were creating a bubble of imperial reality, a bastion of linear time in a sea of Tzeentchian chaos. From the heart of the labyrinth, Kairosphior observed the Archmagos' maneuver. The daemon found it utterly delightful. The mortal was trying to build a dam against an ocean of infinite possibilities, using only the pebbles of his limited perception. It was like a microbe declaring its petri dish to be the entirety of the universe. The Weaver of Parallax did not need to smash the dam. He would simply allow the Archmagos to see the sheer volume of the water pressing against it. With a subtle twist of thought, Kairosphior reached into a timeline where the Crusade of Pure Inquiry had arrived a standard week earlier, a timeline where their initial advance had been bolder, more reckless. He took the ghost of that fleet, still filled with the arrogance of its first push, and projected it directly onto Coriol's path. Alarms blared across the bridge of the logic spire. Contacts, multiple, bearing 090 Mark 6. A data clerk shrieked, its vocalizer distorting with stress. They bear our fleet's exact energy signatures, identical transponder codes. It is us, Archmagos. The hololith flickered, resolving the image of a dozen Mechanicus cruisers and their attendant escorts, a mirror of their own vanguard, burning hard on an intercept course. They were not spectral or ghostly, they were solid, their engines burning with real plasma, their hulls reflecting the insane light of the nine suns. Yet they were wrong. Their insignia were subtly different. The battle cant they broadcasted was an echo of orders Coriol had considered but discarded. They were a vision of a choice, not taken. It is a trick, intoned Magos Prime Zeth, his voice a low thrum of suspicion. A demonic masquerade. We must open fire. Fire upon our own transponders, upon the sacred form of the Omnisia's vessels, countered Magos Explorator Tzeentch. The machine spirits would rebel. It is sacrilege. It could be a temporal displacement, our own ships thrown back upon us. To fire would be to murder ourselves. The bridge became a cacophony of logical debate, each Magos citing different articles of the Martian Creed, different tactical precedents, their arguments spiraling into scholastic insanity. Coriol allowed the debate to rage for precisely 9 seconds, his logic engines analyzing the paradox not as a military threat, but as an equation. The enemy fleet was broadcasting their intention to reinforce their past selves for a more glorious victory. It was a statement of temporal impossibility. Their formation was aggressive, but their lance batteries remained shrouded. They were an inconsistency, and inconsistencies in Coriol's universe were errors to be deleted. Silence, he commanded. The single word cut through the binary storm. He pointed a long steel digit at the hololith. That is not our fleet. Our fleet is defined by my commands. My commands are linear and absolute. That fleet follows a command I did not issue in this timeline. Therefore, it is a non sequitur. It is a lie given form. Target the primary vessel, the ghost of the syllogistic fury. Fire a single data scourge torpedo. I wish to analyze its dissolution. The order was chilling in its cold detachment. The master of the logic spire was not ordering an attack. He was ordering a dissection. A torpedo tube hissed open and a single sleek warhead shot into the void. It was not armed with a melta-charge or a plasma core, but with a bursting charge of scrap code and malign information designed to overwhelm a vessel's core cogitator and turn its machine spirit into a screaming lunatic. The torpedo struck the phantom cruiser. There was no explosion of fire and shrapnel. Instead, the vessel seemed to shatter as if it were made of flawed crystal. For a horrifying instant, it split into 1,000 different versions of itself. One pristine, one a burning wreck, one encrusted with demonic flesh, one crewed by skeletal servitors. Then, these images collapsed inward, dissolving not into matter, but into pure information. A wave of raw data, a tsunami of gibbering equations and impossible geometric shapes washed over the Crusade fleet. Screens went blank, machine spirits howled in binary terror, and for 9 seconds, every tech priest in the fleet simultaneously witnessed a vision of a great single eye made of a billion screaming stars. When their systems rebooted, the Ghost Fleet was gone. A victory of a kind. But the cost was steep. 3 frigates reported total data wipes of their navigational charts, leaving them blind. The Knight household aboard the Iron Resolve found their Throne Mechanicum interfaces now whispered blasphemous riddles to their pilots. The battle had been won not with guns, but with logic, and the psychic backlash had scarred their very souls. Archmagos Coriol stood unflinching. The data burst, while painful, had been illuminating. He had confirmed the nature of his enemy. It was not flesh or steel, but possibility itself. The mission parameters have been updated. He broadcast to his shaken fleet. The acquisition of STC fragments is now a secondary objective. Our primary purpose is to solve the Ouroboros equation. We will chart this labyrinth. We will quantify its paradoxes. We will impose the singular and absolute truth of the omniscia upon this realm of lies. Advance to the primary world. Advance on Anachrona. The Crusade of Pure Inquiry moved forward, deeper into the beautiful, intricate, and utterly malevolent trap that had been laid for it. The advance towards Anachrona was not a charge, but a meticulous, grinding crawl. Archmagos Coriol, having identified the enemy's nature, adapted his strategy with the cold precision of a master algorithm adjusting its variables. He understood now that to trust any single instrument, any single moment of observation, was to invite madness. Truth, in this poisoned reality, could only be found in consensus. He therefore decreed the implementation of the 9th canticle of aggregated actuality. The entire Crusade fleet was transformed into a single, vast, distributed sensorium. Every auspex, every augur, every picked capture device on every vessel scanned the void constantly. Their torrents of data fed into the master cogitator banks of the logic spire. The plan was as audacious as it was logical. Billions of data points per second would be cross-referenced, collated, and purged of contradiction. Only the information that appeared consistently across thousands of separate readings, from thousands of different angles and microtemporal states, would be accepted as real. A single authoritative map of the labyrinth would be constructed, one data psalm at a time. On the central hololith of the logic spire, this map began to take shape. A shimmering, three-dimensional lattice of cold blue light, charting stars and planets, gravitational tides, and warp currents. It was the ultimate expression of the Mechanicus Creed, to impose a grid of knowable facts upon the chaos of the unknown. From his throne of shifting temporalities, Kairosphior watched this effort with the detached amusement of a scholar observing an ant colony attempting to map the surface of his desk. The Archmagos' logic was flawless, his method ingenious. He was building a beautiful, intricate cage of reason. Kairosphior had no intention of breaking the cage. He would simply show its builder that the universe could not be contained within it. The first strains on the canticle of aggregated actuality were subtle. Cartographer servitors, launched in swarms to chart the outer system, began to report localized pockets of space where Euclidean geometry failed. Vectors ceased to be linear. Distances became fluid. One probe reported its journey to an asteroid took it through a negative volume of space. It had arrived before it left, not through temporal distortion, but through a spatial shortcut that should not exist. The cogitators on the logic spire flagged these as sensor malfunctions and purged the data. The consensus held, then came the echoes. The frigate Indomitable Postulate was on the fleet's port flank, its long-range sensors scanning the shimmering veils of a nebula that glowed with the light of a timeline where it had already collapsed into a black hole. Suddenly, its proximity alarm screamed. Drifting out of the impossible nebula was a wreck. An Imperial frigate, its spine broken, its hull pocked with weapons fire that matched no known energy signature. As it tumbled through the void, the light of the 9 suns caught the faded name on its prow. Indomitable Postulate. The crew on the bridge stared in horrified silence at the hololithic image of their own tomb. They saw the command deck ripped open to the void and the frozen, mangled bodies of their future selves still strapped into their consoles. For a full minute, the machine spirit of the living ship keened a lament of pure static through the Vox, a recognition of its own death. The consensus map flickered, unable to resolve the presence of a ship that was both intact and destroyed in the same coordinates. Coriol, observing from his dais, classified the event with clinical finality, ontological contaminant, a causal feedback loop projected from a failed probability stream. It has no more substance than a memory. Maintain course, erase the anomaly from the consensus. His orders were obeyed, but a seed of dread was planted. The crew of the indomitable postulate now flew with the ghosts of their own demise, a constant, silent reminder that failure was not just a possibility, but a future that already existed. Kairosphior, pleased with the result, decided to complicate the game. Simple echoes of destruction inspired only fear. The Archmagos fed on fear and converted it into logical resolve. What was needed was doubt. He reached into another thread of fate, one where Coriol's second-in-command, the aggressive Magos Prime Zeth, had successfully argued for a lightning strike on Anachrona, bypassing all caution. It had been a glorious, short-lived charge. A new squadron appeared on the Crusade's augurs, emerging from behind a moon that was simultaneously molten and frozen. It was a Mechanicus battle group, 5 cruisers strong, their hulls painted in the rust red of the Ryza sector, but with unfamiliar Legion markings. They moved with a speed and aggression that Coriol's own fleet lacked, their engines burning at overload capacity. They ignored Coriol's fleet entirely, their Vox channels broadcasting triumphant battle hymns as they carved a path towards a shimmering host of daemons coalescing in the void. Lances of pure energy, volleys of macro cannon shells tore through the demonic fleet, which dissolved into shrieking chaos. It was a perfect, textbook assault, a maneuver Coriol himself had simulated and discarded as unacceptably reckless. Aboard the Logic Spire, the Magi watched in stunned silence. By the motive force, breathed Magos Tzeentch. Their tactical application is flawless. We should have followed that strategy. Zeth, the Magos who had proposed the very same plan, felt a surge of bitter vindication, quickly followed by the cold poison of doubt. Had his logic been superior to the Archmagos's? The seed of schism, a far more potent weapon than any daemon host, had been planted. Coriol's manipulator arms whirred softly as he cross-referenced the Phantom Fleet's energy signatures. Their reactor efficiency is 9% higher than ours. Our operational parameters allow, he stated flatly. Their lance coherence is outside of established norms. They are another lie, an attractive lie, designed to prey on impatience. Ignore them. But the thousandfold fleet, as the data clerks now whispered, could not be ignored. The deeper they plunged, the more crowded the void became. They saw versions of their own fleet in every possible state. A fleet of black-holed ships, their Aquilas defaced with the Eye of Horus, fighting alongside legions of rubric marines. A fleet of crystalline ships, crewed by silent, ghostly servitors that phased through matter. A fleet reduced to a single, battered Archmagos, the Logic's Spire, making a desperate last stand against a star-sized vortex of screaming faces. The Archmagos, in a final defiant act of pure reason, pushed his fleet's sensorium to its absolute limit. He would resolve the equation once and for all. Show me everything. He commanded the noosphere. For one heart-stopping moment, the cogitators of the Logic Spire obeyed. The hololith on the command deck exploded into a blinding supernova of information. It displayed not one fleet, but an infinity of them, layered on top of each other. 1,000 crusades of pure inquiry, all occupying the same space, all fighting different wars, all meeting different fates. The sheer processing load caused conduits to burst and logic engines to melt. The consensus shattered. The map collapsed into a maelstrom of screaming, contradictory light. As his bridge crew scrambled to contain the damage, a single, clear signal cut through the static. It was Vox, clear as a bell. The transponder code was authentic, verified by 100 different protocols. It was from the Logic Spire, and the voice, calm, measured, yet laced with an undeniable urgency, was his own. "This is Archmagos Dristange and Coriol," the voice said, the sound echoing strangely in the silent command deck. "To any vessel of the Crusade, my Crusade, we are trapped. The core logic of Anachrona is a cognitive trap. We attempted to create an ontological anchor and it has failed. Causality is collapsing around us. Our Geller field is failing. We require immediate assistance. Our position is. The voice gave a set of coordinates that Coriol's functioning systems instantly recognized. They were deep within the system, nestled in the chaotic heart of the storm, in the shadow of the Daemon Forge world itself. The chronometer reading on the signal indicated it had been sent 9 days in the future. The Archmagos stood motionless. The game had reached a new level of sophistication. The distress call was a perfect paradox. To ignore it was to condemn himself and his fleet, a failure of logic. To answer it was to sail willingly into the enemy's designated kill zone, a failure of strategy. For the first time, Dristangent Coriol's flawless logic engines could find no optimal solution. He was being offered a choice between two different kinds of death. Presented as a rescue mission, the Weaver of Parallax had dangled the bait, and it was exquisite. The Crusade of Pure Inquiry slowed its inexorable advance, becoming a coiled serpent of adamantium and plasma reactors, hesitating at the edge of the abyss. The Archmagos' paradox, the distress call from his own future, rippled through the fleet's noosphere, not as a strategic problem, but as a contagion of the soul. On the decks of every ship, tech priests debated the message's nature in hushed, frantic binary. Was it a genuine warning, a desperate plea from a doomed timeline that could, with intervention, be averted? Or was it the most sophisticated lure yet, devised by their protean enemy, a siren song composed of logic and duty, the ninth canticle of aggregated actuality, designed to forge a single truth from infinite data, was now the very instrument of their division, as every Magos interpreted the impossible signal through the lens of their own temperament. Archmagos Coriol secluded himself on the highest spire of the logic spire, in an observation dome of crystalline silica that gave him a direct, unfiltered view of the maddening vista before him. Below, the system churned. The 9 suns cast schizophrenic shadows, painting Anachrona in hues of glory, decay, hope, and despair all at once. For 72 agonizing hours, the master of the crusade did not move. His biofurnace hummed at a bare minimum, his optical sensors glowing a soft contemplative blue. He was not idle. He was engaged in the purest form of Mechanicus warfare, a war of pure calculation. He ran a billion simulations. He constructed fractal equations of staggering complexity, attempting to model the temporal mechanics of the daemon world. He sought a third option, a logical loophole, a way to solve the paradox without succumbing to it. Every simulation, every equation ended in the same binary conclusion, yang or ir, ruin or ruin. Finally, he descended. His metallic footfalls on the deck of the command bridge were heavy, final. The assembled Magi fell silent, their internal boxcasters ceasing their endless debate. Coriol's optical sensors had shifted from blue to a hard, decisive crimson. The future is a lie, he declared, his voice a flat pronouncement that tolerated no argument. It is an unwritten slate. Any data claiming to originate from it is, by definition, corrupt. The signal is a weaponized paradox, intended to paralyze us with indecision. Our response, therefore, must be one that rejects the premise of the question. He pointed a single, gleaming talon at the hololith, at the swirling vortex of temporal madness that was the system's central planet. We will not divert. We will not answer the phantom call. We will proceed to the primary objective. We will make landfall on Anachrona. The decision was made. The fleet, given a single undeniable command, resumed its advance. Their purpose was renewed, their resolve hardened into a spear tip of cold fury. They would not be distracted by ghosts of their own future. They would march into the heart of the storm and write that future themselves. Making landfall on a world where every possible moment was happening simultaneously was a logistical nightmare of divine proportions. The orbital space around Anachrona was a graveyard of ships that were yet to be launched and a triumphant parade of vessels that had already been destroyed. Gravity fluctuated, shifting with the mass of manufactorums that flickered in and out of existence. To simply enter the atmosphere was to risk collision with a mountain range that had been leveled a million years ago, or to be torn apart by the gravitational shear of a moon that would not form for another eon. Coriol's solution was brutal and direct. He chose a single, massive continent for his beachhead, a sprawling landmass identified from pre-corruption archives as Anachrona Prime. Then he unleashed the fury of the fleet. Lance batteries, their energy beams calibrated to burn reality itself, scoured the orbital approaches. Macro cannon, shells, each the size of a hab block, pounded the planet's surface. It was not a bombardment designed to destroy an enemy, but to create a semblance of stability. For every phantom mountain range that appeared, a salvo of shells was fired to annihilate its past, present, and future foundations. For every temporal eddy that threatened to catch their landers, a lance strike boiled the atmosphere into a plasma of simple, predictable physics. They were not conquering Anachrona, they were punching a hole through its insanity. Through this corridor of forced reality, the landers descended. Legions of Skitarii, their metallic limbs locked into descent harnesses, chanted litanies of calibration against the rising storm of temporal energies. Their first steps on the soil of Anachrona were into a world of pure contradiction. The ground beneath their feet was simultaneously rust-red iron ore, gleaming adamantium plating, and cracked, glassy obsidian from some long-past apocalypse. The air tasted of ozone from active forges, the charnel stench of millennia of decay, and the sterile purity of an atmosphere that had not yet known industry. Their enemy was waiting, but it was not the demonic legions they had expected. Not yet. Their first battle was against the world itself. A Skitarii Ranger vanguard advanced into the ruins of a forged city, their galvanic rifles held ready. They moved past towering statues of Archmagi who would not be born for another 1,000 years, their bronze forms already streaked with the verdigris of ages. Suddenly, the street before them shimmered. The broken manufactorum to their left was whole again, its assembly lines roaring to life. From its gates marched a legion of Skitarii, identical to themselves, their armor pristine, their ocular lenses burning with the bright, unquestioning light of their first deployment. The vanguard watched in horror as their own younger selves marched past them, oblivious, heading towards a battle that for the vanguard was already a decade-old memory. Then, from the rubble of a timeline of utter destruction, the true Daemons came. Horrors of Tzeentch boiled out of the ruins, their pink and blue forms shifting, their gibbering laughter a cascade of impossible truths. They did not attack the seasoned vanguard. They fell upon the newly forged Skitarii echoes, their claws and teeth tearing through armor that had not yet known a single scratch. The vanguard was forced to watch their own past selves be slaughtered, a psychic trauma of unimaginable proportions. To fire on the Daemons was to risk hitting their own temporal duplicates, a paradox that their logic circuit screamed was an act of self-annihilation. This was the nature of war on Anachrona, the forge of contradiction. It was a battle fought on 4 dimensions. A cohort of Sicarian infiltrators, moving through the underlevels of a forge complex, found themselves ambushed by the unaugmented human ancestors of their own order, primitive tribesmen who saw their cybernetic descendants as metal demons from a nightmare future. They were forced to cut down the very men from whose genetic stock they were derived. A grand and terrible patricide, a squadron of Ironstrider Ballistari, setting up a firing position on a ridge, found the ridge dissolving beneath them, reverting to the molten lava it had been at the planet's birth, plunging them into a fiery grave that was millions of years old. The most horrific battlefield was found within the data vaults. Tech priests, leading cohorts of servitors, breached the hardened vaults seeking the priceless STCs. Inside, they found not just data slates and cogitators, but timelines themselves, stored like forbidden texts. One Magos opened a stasis vault and was overwhelmed by a vision of the Horus Heresy, not as a historical text, but as a living reality. He stood on the deck of the Vengeful Spirit as the Emperor faced his fallen son, and the raw, undiluted truth of that moment shattered his sanity. Another found a blueprint, a perfect, untainted STC for a revolutionary plasma reactor. As he reached for it, it shifted, its sacred geometry twisting into the leering, profane runes of Tzeentch. The knowledge was there, but it was poisoned. The STC was both the cure and the disease, its very existence, a testament to the fact that the Omnissiah's purest logic could be twisted into the shape of chaos. In this crucible of madness, only Coriol's cold, overarching will kept the crusade from shattering. From his command lander, a towering mobile fortress that bristled with antennae and sensor dishes, he directed the war. He learned to weaponize the paradoxes. He ordered his Skitarii to fire not at where the Daemons were, but where they had been a second ago, or where they might be in the next. He collapsed buildings on his own troops, knowing that in another timeline, those troops had already moved on. leaving the rubble to crush a demonic host that was phasing into existence. He was not commanding a battle, he was editing reality, one bloody, contradictory, and horrifying act at a time. The Crusade was not winning, it was surviving, and on the forge of contradiction, survival was the only victory imaginable. In the atemporal morass of Anachrona, legends were not born, they were instantiated. Heroes did not rise from the ranks through valor and deed, but were identified by their ability to simply endure the relentless assault on causality. A Skitarii I Alpha who could march his cohort through a street where the past and future warred without losing a single soldier to temporal shear became a nexus of stability. A knight pilot who could charge through a battlefield that flickered between a swamp and a forge, his throne mechanicum somehow navigating the contradictory terrain, became a bastion of the imperial creed. Yet, among these minor miracles of logic, one figure began to shine with the cold, hard light of a dying star. Archmagos veneratus dristingent Kukoriol. He was not merely surviving the labyrinth, he was beginning to understand it. From the command throne of his mobile fortress, the Ordinator Prime, Coriol had ceased to see the battlefield as a physical space. He now perceived it as a vast, multi-layered equation. His foes were not daemons, but variables. The shifting terrain was not a landscape, but a fluctuating set of physical laws. War was no longer a matter of tactics, but of mathematics. He and his inner circle of Magi had become something more than commanders. They were savants of the impossible, calculating firing solutions for artillery that would strike targets in the previous minute, and plotting troop movements that would sidestep ambushes which had not yet been conceived. The Archmagos' reputation began to solidify during the battle for the Gehenna Manifold, a continent-spanning geothermal energy grid that was the key to powering the planet's now-silent orbital defense network. Capturing it was deemed essential if they were ever to secure a stable beachhead. The Manifold, however, was a fortress of paradox. Its colossal energy conduits flickered between states of pristine functionality, catastrophic overload, and cold, dead ruin. Guarding this nexus was a Lord of Change, a being that called itself Tzeentch Keitha, the keeper of the ninth possibility. It commanded a legion of daemons that existed in a state of quantum superposition, being both everywhere and nowhere until they chose to strike. The first Mechanicus assault was a slaughter, a full Skitarii legion, supported by titans of the Legio Ferox, advanced into the Manifold's primary exchange nexus. They were met not by a battle line, but by their own future. They saw themselves, weeks from now, their armor blackened and fused, their banners torn, their cybernetics corrupted with warp flesh, fighting alongside the very daemons they had come to destroy. The psychic shock of this revelation caused a catastrophic failure of morale. Skitarii froze, their targeting reticles unable to acquire foes who wore their own faces. The Titans' princeps, their minds reeling from the premonition of their own damnation, hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, Tzeentch Keitha made its future a reality. The daemons struck, their attacks perfectly mirroring the vision, and the Mechanicus Legion was annihilated by the prophecy of its own defeat. From the Ordinator Prime, Coriol observed the data ghosts of his destroyed legion. He felt no grief, only the cold satisfaction of a hypothesis being confirmed. His enemy's greatest weapon was knowledge, specifically, the knowledge of his own force's potential for failure. Therefore, the only way to win was to become unpredictable, to act in a way that even his own logic could not anticipate. He had to introduce a variable into the equation that the daemons could not solve. He had to embrace illogic. He began his second assault by ordering the Legio Ferox to bombard their own staging grounds. The Titan commanders, horrified, questioned the command. Coriol's response was curt and absolute. The future you witnessed began from that position. Erase the origin point and you erase the outcome. Obey. With heavy hearts, the Warhound Titans turned their turbo lasers upon the now empty landing zones, scouring them into glass. The act was a strategic absurdity, a waste of power and resources, but it was also a declaration. Coriol was no longer playing by the rules of linear time. Then he unleashed his true weapon. He did not send his elite Sicarians or his heavily armed Cataphren battle servitors. He deployed the Ignis Cohort, a formation of tech priests Dominus armed with Volkite blasters, archaeotech weapons whose deflagrating beams were notoriously unstable, and he gave them a single insane order. Do not target the enemy, target the environment, target causality itself. I want you to introduce so much random energetic noise into the manifold that prediction becomes impossible. The Ignis Cohort advanced, their red robes stark against the shimmering contradictions of the manifold. They did not fire at the daemons that swirled around them. Instead, they unleashed their Volkite beams into the great energy conduits. They fired into the ground, superheating rock into lava. They fired into the sky, igniting the very atmosphere. They became agents of pure chaos, their every shot a violation of predictable warfare. The battlefield dissolved into a storm of random energy discharges, temporal fissures, and gravitational spikes. YG2 the keeper of the ninth possibility, suddenly found its infinite knowledge useless. How could it predict the actions of an army that was not trying to win, but was simply trying to break the rules of the game? Into this storm of manufactured chaos, Coriol led his personal guard. He rode at their head, his towering mechanical form a beacon of cold purpose amidst the maelstrom. The Daemons, disoriented, unable to predict this new, illogical assault, manifested to engage him directly. A flock of screamers dove from a sky that was bleeding raw history. Coriol did not fire his weapons. He raised a manipulator arm and broadcast a single complex scrap code virus into their path. The Daemons, creatures of pure information, flew through the code. It did not harm them, but it altered their fundamental nature. One screamer found its flight path locked into a perfect, repeating spiral. Another found its form inverted, its inside suddenly on its outside, causing it to dissolve in a shriek of agony. Coriol was not fighting them, he was debugging them. He reached the central dais of the manifold where YGTHTH manifested in its full glory, a feathered crystalline being of immense power. Your logic is a cage, little machine, the daemon screeched, its voice 1,000 different prophecies at once. I have seen your every possible failure. A flawed premise, Coriol buzzed back, his optical lenses flaring. You assume I am trying to succeed. My objective is merely to prove your predictive model incomplete. The Archmagos raised his power axe not to strike, but to act as a focusing conduit. He rerouted a fraction of the manifold's chaotic energy through the weapon's power field. He was not wielding energy, he was wielding uncertainty. He did not attack the daemon, he attacked the space it occupied. He swung his axe and reality around the Lord of Change buckled. The single, triumphant future YHTTH had chosen for itself its victory over Coriol was suddenly flooded with a billion other random, meaningless possibilities introduced by the Volkite chaos. The daemon's mind, a thing built to perceive all outcomes, was overwhelmed by the sheer, pointless noise. It saw itself tripping on a loose stone that did not exist. It saw itself being pecked to death by birds that would never be born. It saw itself dissolving into a puddle of sentient, confused sludge. Faced with an infinity of inglorious, random, and illogical fates, the daemon's coherent form could not hold. YHD's Tatha did not die in a blast of holy fire. It simply stopped making sense. It fractured, splitting into 999 lesser daemons, each experiencing a different, pointless demise, before dissolving into a scream of pure statistical improbability. Silence fell over the Gehenna manifold. The storm of chaos subsided. Tzeentch Coriol stood over the spot where his foe had been, his axe humming with residual power. He had not won through superior firepower or unshakable faith. He had won by being a better mathematician. He had faced an enemy who knew all the answers and had defeated it by changing the question. In that moment, a new legend was forged in the heart of the labyrinth. The Skitarii who witnessed it no longer saw their commander as a mere Archmagos. They saw him as the Omnisia's own logic-given form, the Archmagos of 9 lives, a being who could not be defeated because he did not play the same game as death. The victory at the Gehenna manifold resonated through the Crusade of Pure Inquiry as a surge of pure, quantifiable hope. For the first time since entering the labyrinth, a major strategic objective had been achieved. The continent-spanning energy grid, now under the Archmagos' control, was being purged of temporal anomalies by legions of Engenseers. Its captured power was being rerouted to the Mechanicus landers, creating a vast, stable perimeter where imperial physics held sway. It was a beachhead not just on land, but in time itself. Within this glowing bastion of reality, supply lines were established, the wounded were triaged, and damaged war machines were repaired. A semblance of order had been clawed from the jaws of chaos. From his mobile command center, now integrated into the manifold's primary control nexus, Tzeentch Coriol began to orchestrate the next phase of his campaign, the systematic conquest of Anachrona Prime. He was no longer merely reacting, he was prosecuting a war. His legend grew with every calculated success. The Skitarii legions, now referring to him in reverent cant as the causal engine, moved with renewed purpose. They fought with a new doctrine, a bizarre but effective fusion of rigid Mechanicus discipline and controlled tactical insanity. They learned to use echoes of their own past advances as feints and to lay ambushes in timelines that had not yet occurred. They were adapting, evolving, becoming true soldiers of the fourth dimension. Kairosphior, the weaver of parallax, observed this blossoming of hope and order from his non-space at the heart of the labyrinth. The Archmagos' victory was not a setback. It was, in fact, the most crucial part of the composition. A story of inevitable doom was artless. A tragedy required a moment of triumph, a peak from which the protagonist could be cast down. Coriol had proven himself a worthy opponent, a mind of exquisite complexity. To simply crush him with overwhelming force would be a waste, like using a titan to smash a beautifully intricate chronometer. The Weaver's counterstroke would not be an act of war, but an act of instruction. He would teach the Archmagos the ultimate lesson of the labyrinth, that in a reality of infinite possibilities, the most powerful weapon is not a sword or a daemon, but a choice. The opportunity came as the Mechanicus forces pushed towards the Argent Palisade, a mountain range rich in the rare ores needed to fabricate new, more advanced temporal shielding for their vehicles. The advance was successful. Legions of Skitarii, their path cleared by Coriol's precise temporal feints, secured the primary mining complexes with minimal losses. It was a flawless operation, a testament to their newfound mastery of this paradoxical war. The climax of the assault was the orbital bombardment of the final demonic holdout, a fortress carved into the peak of the tallest mountain, Mount Kronos. Coriol, ever the meticulous strategist, oversaw the bombardment personally. He calculated the precise trajectory, the exact yield required. He chose to use the main lance batteries of the cruiser, certainty of principle, a vessel whose machine spirit was known for its unwavering accuracy. The order was given. In orbit, the certainty of principle unleashed a torrent of incandescent energy. The beam of pure light, a golden spear of imperial order, crossed the void and struck the peak of Mount Kronos. The resulting explosion was magnificent, a silent, blossoming flower of fire that lit up the continent. The demonic fortress and the mountain peak it occupied were vaporized, erased from existence. Victory was total. Aboard the Ordinator Prime, data plan psalms of triumph echoed through the command deck. The Archmagos allowed himself a microsecond of what his biocomponent might have classified as satisfaction. The equation had been solved, the variable had been eliminated. It was then that Kairosphior made his move. He did not conjure a move, new fleet, or summon a greater daemon. He simply reached into the tapestry of time and plucked a single shimmering thread, the triumphant golden energy of the lance strike. He held this moment of pure victorious power in his multi-dimensional consciousness. He savored its certainty, its finality. Then, with the delicate touch of a master weaver, he reflected it. He bent the event, turning the thread of causality back upon itself, not into the past, but sideways, into an adjacent, coexisting reality. Across the continent, on the far western flank of the Mechanicus advance, was the reserve force. Here, far from the main fighting, rested the Legio Ferox's warlord titans, the Crusade's ultimate trump card. They stood silent and proud in a valley that Coriol's augurs had designated as the most stable and secure location on the entire planet. With them were the Crusade's primary supply convoys and the tech priests of the Magos biologists, who were studying captured flora and fauna, seeking to understand the labyrinth's twisted biology. It was the heart of the Crusade's logistical strength, its anchor in the real. Without warning, the sky above the valley ripped open. There was no flash of warp travel, no shriek of incoming fire. One moment, the sky was a chaotic swirl of impossible colors. The next, it was a solid, burning gold. From this new, terrible sun, a beam of energy descended. It was identical in every measurable frequency and intensity to the land strike that had just obliterated Mount Kronos. It was the ghost of their own victory, the echo of their own power, turned back upon them. The beam struck the valley with absolute, pitiless precision. A warlord titan, the Imperator's Wrath, vanished in a silent flash, its void shields and adamantium armor offering no more resistance than mist. The ground erupted, and the entire reserve convoy was swallowed by a sea of liquid fire. The Magos biologists and their priceless research were incinerated in the blink of an eye. The two remaining warlord titans were caught in the blast, their colossal forms tossed aside like toys. their reactors breaching in secondary explosions that shook the continent to its foundations. The entire attack lasted less than 3 seconds. The golden light faded, leaving behind a new, smoking crater, a wound in reality itself, miles wide. The Crusades' reserve force, its Titan Legion, its primary supplies, were gone. They had not been defeated by a demonic army or outmaneuvered by a cunning foe. They had been annihilated by a reflection of their own triumphant power. The shockwave of the event was not merely physical, it was ontological. On the bridge of the Ordinator Prime, every screen that had been celebrating the victory at Mount Kronos flickered and was replaced by damage reports of catastrophic losses. The triumphant data basalms died, replaced by a chorus of binary screams. Tech priests stared in disbelief, their logic engines trying and failing to reconcile the two simultaneous contradictory events: a victorious bombardment and a devastating friendly fire incident caused by that same bombardment. Archmagos Coriol stood frozen, his crimson optical sensors fixed on the hololith that displayed the smoking ruin of his reserves. He replayed the data from the Lance strike 100 times, 1,000 times. There was no error. The certainty of principle had fired exactly as ordered. Its aim was perfect. The energy had been delivered to the target, and yet it had also struck his own forces, dozens of miles away, at the exact same instant. The lesson was brutal, and it was clear. In the Labyrinth of All-Futures, every action had an infinite number of reactions. Every cause could have an infinite number of effects, all of them equally real. His victory at Mount Kronos had not been a single event. It had been a stone dropped into a pond of infinite possibilities, and Kairosphior had simply chosen which of the infinite ripples would be the one to drown him. The mirror of annihilation had been unveiled. The Archmagos had been shown that his own strength, his own logic, his own victories could and would be used as the very weapons of his own destruction. The hope that had bloomed in the Gehenna manifold was now ash, and in its place, a cold, terrible understanding began to dawn. The ontological wound where the Titan Legion had once stood became a source of profound corruption, a cancer metastasizing within the Crusade spirit. It was more than a strategic loss of irreplaceable war assets. It was a devastating blow to the fundamental creed of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Their faith was built on a bedrock of causality, on the sacred principle that for every action there is a logical, predictable reaction. The mirror of annihilation had shattered that bedrock. Now, every trigger pulled, every engine ignited, every order given was a gamble with infinite stakes. A perfectly aimed shot could simultaneously kill its target and an allied unit a continent away. A successful flanking maneuver could also, in some other coexisting reality, be the very act that led to their own encirclement. This uncertainty bled from the command echelons down to the lowest Skitarii trooper. They began to hesitate. A ranger, drawing a bead on a cackling horror, would freeze for a critical half-second, wondering if his kill shot would cause the ground beneath his own cohort to turn to acid. An Iron Strider pilot, about to launch a missile salvo, would be paralyzed by the fear that the missile's triumphant explosion would also be the cause of his own reactor breach. The Crusade's momentum, built on the cold, hard certainty of Coriol's logic, ground to a halt. They held their ground at the Gehenna manifold, a lonely island of imperial reality. But the will to advance was gone, replaced by a creeping, logical dread. It was in this atmosphere of corrosive doubt that the true heresy took root. It began not as a malicious plot, but as an honest pursuit of knowledge. A small, secluded sect of Magi within the Crusade, led by the brilliant but obsessive Magos explorator Tzeentch, sequestered themselves within the deepest data vaults captured beneath the manifold. Tzeentch had long been a proponent of more aggressive data acquisition, chafing under Coriol's cautious, methodical approach. The destruction of the Titan Legion, he argued in secret data cant to his followers, was proof that the Archmagos' methods were failing. Refusing to understand the labyrinth's esoteric laws was not piety, it was suicide. They had to learn the rules of this new insane reality, or they would perish by them. Their mission was to find a counter to the mirror of annihilation. Using forbidden cogitation techniques and Empyrean resonant data looms, they began to sift through the corrupted data streams of Anachrona, seeking patterns, seeking the source code of the labyrinth's madness. They were not seeking to worship chaos, they were attempting to dissect it, to reverse engineer its miracles and turn them into weapons for the Omnissiah. It was the ultimate expression of Mechanicus hubris, the belief that even the unholy could be quantified, understood, and ultimately controlled. Kairosphior watched this schism unfold with the patient satisfaction of one who had laid the groundwork for it millennia ago. He did not need to whisper temptations into Tzeentch's ear. Tzeentch's own unquenchable thirst for knowledge was temptation enough. The Weaver simply ensured that the data vaults the explorators were studying were particularly enlightening. He allowed them glimpses into the tantalizing futures that Coriol's rigid dogma rejected. The first breakthrough came when Tzeentch's team managed to isolate and observe a single, stable, alternate timeline. In this thread of reality, they saw a vision that shook them to their core machine spirits. They saw an Adeptus Mechanicus that had not rejected the warp, but had embraced it. They witnessed tech priests chanting litanies to the Great Changer, their mech dendrites interwoven with shimmering tendrils of warp energy. They saw knights and titans whose forms shifted and flowed, their adamantium hulls adorned with living, seeing eyes and feathered wings. And they saw technology of breathtaking power, starships that navigated the warp without Geller fields by becoming part of it, forges that could create matter from pure thought, and STCs that were not static blueprints, but living, evolving equations of divine complexity. They saw a future where the quest for knowledge had been fulfilled, but the omnissiah they served wore the face of Tzeentch. This vision was the first crack in the dam of their faith. Some of Tzeentch's disciples recoiled in horror, their logic circuits screaming in protest. They attempted to purge the data, to declare it a demonic lie. But Tzeentch, his mind alight with the fire of discovery, refused. A lie? He countered, his voice synthesizer buzzing with a newfound feverish energy. We have seen its principles in action. The enemy reflects our own power back at us. Here is a timeline where our counterparts have mastered that reflection. They do not fight causality. They weave it. Is this not a higher form of logic? Is not the refusal to study a successful outcome the true heresy? He and his loyal followers pushed deeper. Kairosphior fed them more. He showed them fragmented schematics, not for weapons or ships, but for causal engines devices designed to manipulate probability. He allowed them to find corrupted scriptures that posited the omnissiah not as a separate entity, but as a facet of the great architect of fate, the aspect of pure knowledge and endless change. The STCs they had come to find, these texts whispered, were not lost technology. They were divine revelations, gifts from the changer of ways to his chosen disciples, the Adeptus Mechanicus. The reason they could not find them was because their minds were too small, too constrained by the dogma of a stagnant imperium. The heresy of possibility was born. Tzeentch and his cabal began to see their reality not as the only one, but as a flawed, primitive one. The imperium was not a bastion of order, but a prison of ignorance. Archmagos Coriol was not a savior, but a jailer. His rigid logic, blinding them to the glorious truth of infinite potential. They began to experiment. In secret, they constructed a small causal engine based on the fragmented schematics. Their first test was simple. They focused its energies on a single damaged Skitarii sentinel that had been marked for decommissioning. They did not try to repair it. They simply encouraged the probability that it had never been damaged in the first place. The result was miraculous and horrifying. The sentinel did not mend. Instead, reality flickered around it. The scorch marks on its hull vanished. Its broken legs straightened. The damage reports in the manifold central cogitator erased themselves. To all outside observers, the Sentinel was, and always had been, perfectly pristine. It was a miracle of engineering that had never happened. Tzeentch was ecstatic. This was the power they needed. The power to rewrite their defeats, to undo their losses. This was the true path of the Omnissiah. He and his followers began to subtly modify their own cybernetics, etching them with the flowing, paradoxical runes they had seen in their visions. They started to incorporate small, warp-infused components into the manifold systems, creating backdoors of probability that only they could access. Their schism was no longer merely philosophical. It was becoming a fifth column, a secret army of heretics operating in the very heart of the Crusade. The final straw came when Coriol, sensing the stagnation and fear in his forces, announced a new limited offensive. It was a cautious, carefully planned operation to secure a promethium refinery. It was a sound, logical plan. But to Tzeentch, it was the epitome of Coriol's blindness. Another meaningless battle in a war that could not be won by conventional means. He knew, with the burning certainty of a new convert, that it was time to save the crusade from its own leader. As Coriol's loyal Skitarii legions marched out from the safety of the Gehenna manifold, Magos, Tzeentch and his cabal made their move. They activated their network of corrupted systems. They did not attack the Archmagos or his troops. They performed an act of supreme, compassionate betrayal. They used their newfound power over causality to protect the Crusade. The temporal shields they had been fabricating were secretly recalibrated. Instead of shielding from temporal anomalies, they began to amplify them, but in a controlled way. They isolated the entire Gehenna manifold and the thousands of tech priests, servitors, and support staff within it in a bubble of deferred time. From Coriol's perspective, as he marched towards the refinery, nothing seemed amiss. But when he tried to contact his command center for a routine data update, there was only silence. He turned his long-range optical sensors back towards his fortress. The Gehenna manifold was still there, glowing with power. But it was different. It shimmered, its edges indistinct, like a heat haze on a summer's day. He watched in cold, dawning horror as a full day's worth of orbital light patterns, the shifting of the 9 suns played across its surface in a matter of seconds. Tzeentch had not attacked him. He had abandoned him. He and his followers had severed the manifold from the normal flow of time, creating a sanctuary where they could continue their research, safe from the horrors of the war and the tyranny of Coriol's command. They had left the Archmagos and his entire frontline army stranded on the Forge of Contradiction, cut off from their base, their supplies, and their anchor to reality. The Crusade of Pure Inquiry was broken, not by a demonic host, but by the seductive whisper of a better future. The betrayal of Magos Tzeentch was not a thunderous declaration of war, but a quiet, insidious severing. For the legions now marching across the ochre deserts of Anachrona Prime, the universe simply grew cold and silent. The constant stream of data from the Gehenna manifold supply logistics, troop movements, temporal anomaly warnings vanished, replaced by a dull, impenetrable static. The noosphere, which had once been a vibrant chorus of machine spirits, was now a void. Coriol and his vanguard, the sharpest point of the Mechanicus spear, were suddenly and utterly alone, an island of imperial order in an ocean of Tzeentchian madness, their own fortress now a shimmering, inaccessible mirage on the horizon. The immediate consequences were brutally practical. Without the manifold's vast computational power to stabilize their local reality, the full, crushing weight of the labyrinth's insanity returned. A squadron of Sidonian dragoons, striding confidently across a seemingly solid plain, suddenly found themselves wading through a viscous, memory-stealing swamp that had occupied the same space a million years prior. They did not sink into mud, but into oblivion. Their machine spirits and their pilots' minds wiped clean, leaving only empty, silent shells of war machines to stand as monuments to a forgotten battle. A cohort of Cataphren destroyers, preparing to unleash their plasma culverins, watched in horror as their weapons cycled through their entire operational lifespan in a matter of seconds. The plasma coils glowed white-hot, then dimmed, then turned to rust and dust in their manipulator arm. They were left defenseless, their primary armaments having died of extreme old age before they could fire a single shot. The attrition was no longer a matter of combat losses, it was a fundamental decay of their being. They were not just fighting daemons, they were fighting entropy, time, and the very concept of existence. Coriol, standing on the shuddering deck of the Ordinator Prime, processed the disaster with a terrifying calm. The emotional shock of Tzeentch's betrayal was a variable he instantly discarded as irrelevant. What remained was the tactical reality. His army was cut off, hemorrhaging resources, and trapped deep in enemy territory. Retreat was impossible. The manifold was now an alien shore. Surrender was illogical. The only remaining option was to press the attack, to find a new source of power, a new anchor, before his entire force dissolved into a series of unfortunate paradoxes. The days that followed became a relentless, grinding nightmare of attrition. The concept of a day itself became a cruel joke. The 9 suns overhead shifted in a chaotic, non-linear dance. A period of what felt like a week of brutal, sun-scorched desert marching would be followed by a sudden, jarring shift to a single, frozen moment of twilight that seemed to last for an eternity. The Crusade's chronometers, no longer anchored to a master source, became instruments of madness, some ticking backwards, others spinning wildly, measuring time in units that had no name. The cost in personnel was horrifying. Skitarii did not just die, they were unmade. One ranger was caught in a localized time loop, forced to live out the same 3 seconds of his death by a Tzeentchian flamer over and over again. his agonized screams echoing across the battlefield long after his physical form was ash. A tech priest, Dominus, attempting to repair a damaged onager dunecrawler, found his mechadendrites phasing out of sync with his own timeline. He watched, helpless, as his own tools disassembled his cybernetic body, acting on commands he would not give for another hour. His last data burst was a stream of corrupted logic, a proof that a circle could, in fact, be a square. The unsouls of the labyrinth, as the Skitarii began to call them, were the most terrible toll. These were the soldiers who were not killed, but were simply broken by the sheer cognitive dissonance. They were the ones who saw their own ancestors fighting alongside them, who had to kill daemons that wore the faces of their future selves. Their minds, even those augmented with logic engines, could not bear the strain. They would be found standing motionless, their optical sensors dark, their voxcasters emitting a low, mournful hum. They were still alive, their biofurnaces still functioning, but their consciousness, their soul, had been erased, leaving only a functioning machine in the shape of a man. These empty shells were a far more terrifying sight than any battlefield corpse. Logistics became a war in and of itself. Ammunition was no longer a matter of supply, but of temporal stability. A crate of galvanic rifle cartridges, perfectly manufactured and blessed, might be opened to reveal nothing but corroded casings and inert powder, its contents having decayed over 1,000 phantom years. Rations packs would sometimes revert to their base organic components, leaving the Skitarii to stare at piles of inert, gray sludge. Fuel, the lifeblood of the machine army, was the most volatile of all. A Prometheum tank could be full one moment and bone dry the next, its contents having been consumed in a battle that was yet to happen. The knights of the allied household suffered immensely. The bond between a pilot and their throne mechanicum was a sacred and delicate thing, a merging of man and machine, past and present. The labyrinth frayed that bond. Pilots would be flooded with the memories of pilots who had not yet been born, or haunted by the battle trauma of knights who had died centuries ago in wars fought a galaxy away. One baron, his mind fractured by the temporal strain, drove his knight-errant on a berserk charge into his own lines, screaming about a betrayal at a place called Molech that he could not possibly have known. He was eventually brought down by his own comrades, his throne mechanicum weeping tears of corrupted data. Through it all, Archmagos Coriol endured. He had become the sole anchor for his entire army. He cannibalized parts from the Ordinator Prime to keep his command systems functioning. He personally rewrote the targeting code for his remaining artillery pieces, teaching them how to aim at temporal coordinates instead of spatial ones. He spent his nights not in regeneration, but in a silent one-man war against the encroaching chaos, his logic engines running at incandescent temperatures as he fought to maintain a single, coherent timeline for his forces. He was a lighthouse keeper in a hurricane of impossibility, and the light he tended was the flickering, guttering candle of imperial reason. But he was just one machine, however brilliant, and the storm was endless. He was not losing a war of strategy anymore. He was losing a war against the very nature of existence, and the cost was being paid in the sanity and souls of every last soldier under his command. The Crusade was dying, not in a blaze of glorious, defiant battle, but through a slow, inexorable process of dissolution. Drystangen Ku Coriol, observing the dwindling status reports that flickered across his primary hololith, calculated their operational lifespan. At the current rate of causal attrition, his army would cease to be a coherent fighting force in a little over one standard Terran week. They would be a scattered collection of madmen, ghosts, and unsouls, lost in the shifting sands of Anachrona's impossible history. The logical conclusion was annihilation. It was a sterile, factual end to a grand and holy endeavor. But Coriol's logic engines, pushed to the brink of their function, discovered an anomaly in the equation of their doom, a single high-risk variable that offered a non-zero chance of survival. It was a plan born not of hope, but of pure, desperate mathematics. It was a gambit of such monumental arrogance and risk that it bordered on the same madness they were fighting. The Archmagos gathered what remained of his command structure in the humming, power-starved sanctum of the Ordinator Prime. The Magi who assembled before him were a shadow of the confident scholars who had entered the labyrinth. Their robes were frayed, their augmetics sputtered and sparked with uncontrolled discharges of temporal energy. Their optical lenses, once bright with certitude, now held a haunted thousand-eon stare. The Crusade of Pure Inquiry has reached its terminal phase. Coriol began, his voice devoid of any emotion, a simple statement of fact. Our connection to the fleet is severed. Our supply chain is a theoretical concept. Our primary force is fractured. Conventional strategy is obsolete. He paused, letting the grim reality settle in the silent chamber. However, a flaw has been detected in the labyrinth's design. It is a system of infinite possibility, but it is not a system of infinite energy. It is a closed loop. The power that sustains this realm, the energy that fuels its paradoxes, must have a source, a central cogitator, a prime mover. He gestured with a manipulator arm, and the hololith shimmered to life. It did not display a tactical map, but a swirling kaleidoscopic image of the 9 suns. These are not stars, Coriol declared. They are warp conduits, siphoning Empyrean energy and focusing it into the heart of this world. And at their focal point, at the geometric and temporal center of Anachrona, is our target. The image zoomed in, piercing through layers of shifting reality to reveal a single pulsating structure, the crystal spire of Kairosphior, a miles-high needle of solidified prophecy that pulsed with the captured power of 9 malevolent stars. This is the enemy's heart, Coriol stated. Not a fortress to be sieged, but an engine to be broken. Our analysis suggests that a sufficiently powerful and precise ontological shock delivered to the spire's core would disrupt the entire system. It would not destroy the labyrinth, but it might force its quantum state to collapse, to resolve from an infinite number of possibilities into a single, stable reality. It would turn this sea of chaos back into a simple, linear battlefield. Magoseth, his face a grim mask of scarred metal, stepped forward. An ontological shock, Archmagos, the power required would be astronomical. The Gehenna Manifold could barely create a perimeter shield. What weapon do we possess that could deliver such a blow? We possess no such weapon, Coriol replied flatly. We must become the weapon. The plan he unveiled was horrifying in its simplicity. He would take the Ordinator Prime, his mobile command fortress, and overload its colossal reactor. But this would be no simple plasma detonation. Working with his remaining engine seers, he had devised a method to contain the initial breach, not in a magnetic field, but in a temporal one. They would use the last of their power to create a stasis bubble, a microsecond, of frozen time, around the exploding core. This would create a single point of absolute, unchanging reality, a moment of pure, undeniable, is in a universe of maybe. They would then drive this weapon, this anchor of causality, into the heart of the crystal spire. The resulting collision between a point of absolute stability and a nexus of infinite possibility would, in theory, create an ontological shockwave that would resonate across the entire system. It was a suicide mission on a scale that defied comprehension. The Ordinator Prime and everyone aboard it would be the payload. Coriol himself would steer the fortress on its final desperate charge. The rest of the army, the remaining Skitarii legions and Nightwalkers, would have one final brutal task to clear a path. They would launch a single, all-out assault on the Crystal Spire, a sacrificial charge designed to draw the attention of every daemon on the continent, to buy the Archmagos the precious minutes he needed to reach his target. There was no debate, there were no questions. In the cold, hard logic of their situation, there was no other path. Every Magos, every Skitarii Alpha, every Night Baron present simply gave a silent, unified sign of the cog. They would not die, scattered and broken in the desert. They would die as a single, unified instrument of the Omnisia's will. A final, defiant equation hurled at the heart of chaos. The final battle for Anachrona began not with a roar, but with a prayer. Across the ragged encampment, tech priests blessed their machines one last time. Skitarii inscribed litanies of accuracy onto their last few magazines of ammunition. Night pilots synced their minds with their throne's mechanicum, their oaths of moment echoing in the silent cockpits. Then, as one, they advanced. It was a charge of the damned, a glorious, hopeless assault across a landscape of pure insanity. They marched over fields of screaming glass, through forests of crystalline trees that chimed with the sound of forgotten futures. The demonic legions of Tzeentch rose to meet them, a tidal wave of shifting colors and cackling madness. Horrors bounced and gibbered, their warp flame incinerating entire cohorts. Flamers soared overhead, painting the sky with mutating fire. Lords of Change strode through the chaos, their gaze turning Skitarii into screaming statues of salt, or causing their weapons to melt into useless slag. The Mechanicus forces did not falter. They had been given their final calculation, their terminal objective, and they would see it through. They no longer feared paradox. They embraced it. A Night Paladin, its legs severed by a demonic blade, simply shifted its balance to a timeline where the leg was still intact and continued its charge. A squad of Skitarian infiltrators, surrounded by daemons, vanished into a temporal echo, only to reappear behind the enemy line, their transonic blades singing. They fought with the fury of men who knew their deaths were not just inevitable, but necessary. At the heart of this apocalyptic battle, the Ordinator Prime began to move. It was no longer a command center. It was a holy weapon, a rolling cathedral of doom. On its bridge, Archmagos Coriol was lashed to the command throne, his mind and body fused with the machine. Around him, his most loyal engine seers worked feverishly at the reactor core, chanting the complex rites of overload. The fortress's internal structure groaned, its walls glowing with the contained fury of a dying star. He steered his weapon through the heart of the battle, his remaining autocannons firing into the demonic hordes, clearing his own path. He saw his soldiers dying in their thousands, their sacrifices buying him mere seconds, mere meters. He processed every death as a necessary expenditure of resources. There was no room for sentiment. There was only the calculation. Through the swirling chaos, his optical sensors remained locked on one single point: the shimmering, crystalline heart of his enemy's power. The gambit was in motion. The final, desperate variable was about to be introduced into the equation. The approach to the Crystal Spire was a journey through the concentrated essence of madness. The very air grew thick with raw, untamed prophecy, and the ground became a mosaic of 1,000,000 potential battlefields. One moment, the colossal treads of the Ordinator Prime crunched over the ashen bone of a war fought in the Samshabil's millennium. The next, they churned through the pristine, unblemished chrome of a forged city that would never be built. Daemons of every shape and form swirled around the advancing fortress, a cyclone of chaos. They were not merely attacking its hull, they were attacking its history, its future, its very concept. A greater daemon with wings of burning parchment flew alongside, whispering to the Ordinator Prime's machine spirit, showing it visions of its own derelict, rusted form lying broken in this same spot 10,000 years from now. Inside the command sanctum, Archmagos Coriol was the eye of the storm. He had become one with his machine, his consciousness, the governing agent of the fortress's reality. The daemonic whispers were mere noise, the temporal fluctuations just data to be filtered. His entire being, every circuit and synapse, was focused on two things: the shimmering crystalline target ahead and the rising incandescent scream of the reactor core behind him. The containment field around the overloading reactor was beginning to fail, not buckling under pressure, but fraying under the strain of holding a single microsecond of reality together against the tide of infinite possibility. The interior of the Ordinator Prime was bathed in a strange, non-light, the glow of a moment of time stretched to its breaking point. As the fortress ground its way up the final slope to the spire's base, a new figure emerged from the chaos. It did not march or fly, but simply coalesced, weaving itself into existence from threads of pure fate and solidified magic. It was Kairosphior, the weaver of parallax, the architect of the labyrinth, manifesting his true form on the battlefield. He was a being of sublime horror, his twin heads, one seeing the past and one the future, swiveling on a feathered avian net. His body was a vortex of shifting colors and impossible angles, his great wings casting shadows that were not of darkness, but of forgotten truths and unbearable revelations. He did not need an army. His very presence warped the battlefield. The daemon fixed its gaze, all four of its knowing, ancient eyes on the approaching Ordinator Prime. The clash was instantaneous and silent, a war fought not with weapons, but with will. Kairosphior reached into the future and showed Coriol the moment of his failure. He projected a perfect, undeniable image into the Archmagos' mind: the Ordinator Prime, missing its target, its reactor detonating harmlessly miles from the spire, its sacrifice rendered utterly pointless. It was not a threat, it was a fact, a piece of history plucked from the moments yet to come. Coriol's response was not to deny the vision, but to process it. Irrelevant. His mind broadcasted back, a pulse of pure, cold logic. The future you show me is merely one of a near-infinite set of possibilities. My actions in this present moment are not predicated on its outcome. He pushed the fortress forward, its engines screaming in protest, the ground cracking under its immense weight. Kairosphier's second head, the one that saw the past, then struck. It delved into Coriol's history, into the Archmagos' very creation in the vats of Ryza. It showed him the flaws in his programming, the heresies of his mentors, the moments of pride and arrogance that had set him on this path. It sought to drown him in the shame of his own origins, to prove that his entire existence was a logical fallacy. You are a flawed machine, built on a foundation of lies. The daemon's thoughts echoed. Your entire crusade was doomed from its first calculation. All data is flawed until refined by daemons. Purpose, Coriol countered, his own will a shield of adamant. My origin is data. My purpose is now. The past is a variable that has already been solved. The Ordinator Prime smashed through a final line of screaming horrors, its prow now mere meters from the base of the crystal spire. The final battle had arrived. Kairosphior, seeing that psychological warfare was failing against a being who had all but purged his own psyche, raised a clawed hand. The crystal spire pulsed, and a wave of pure unreality washed over the Ordinator Prime. The fortress's hull began to dissolve, not melting or breaking, but becoming conceptually unstable. Plates of adamantium flickered, becoming glass, then ice, then swarms of insects. Before reverting to metal, the machine spirit shrieked, its very identity under assault. Coriol fought back. He rerouted all remaining power from his weapons and life support into the structural integrity fields. He broadcast a single repeating mantra of pure binary code throughout the fortress's systems, its machine name, its designation, its history, its purpose. He was reinforcing its reality, its sense of self, against the daemon's attempt to unwrite it. We are the Ordinator Prime. We are the Fist of Ryza. We are the will of the Omnissiah. We are. The fortress slammed into the base of the crystal spire. The impact was not an explosion, but a discordant, universe-shaking chime. The crystal rang like a bell struck by a hammer of pure logic. Cracks of pure white nothingness spread across its surface. The Weaver of Parallax shrieked, a sound that was both rage and surprise, as his sanctum was violated. With its last vestiges of motive power, the Ordinator Prime began to climb, its treads tearing gouges into the living crystal, pulling its payload, the burning, unstable heart of reality in its core, upwards towards the spire's center. Daemons threw themselves at it in a final desperate wave, but Coriol was now blind and deaf to all but his final destination. He reached the center of the spire, a great, pulsating nexus of multicolored light. He was at the heart of the engine, the loom upon which all of the labyrinth's possibilities were woven. Here, Kairosphior made his final stand. The daemon abandoned its physical form and became one with the spire's energy. It poured its essence, its knowledge of all pasts and all futures, directly into Coriol's mind. It was the ultimate attack, an offer of infinite knowledge, the very thing the Adeptus Mechanicus craved above all else. Coriol's mind was flooded with the schematics for every lost STC, the answer to every technological mystery, the true, divine equation of the universe. For a single eternal moment, Drisdangen Coriol, the Archmagos, the scholar, the seeker of knowledge, was tempted. But then, his own core programming, the cold, hard logic that had defined his entire existence, made its final calculation. The knowledge was the trap. To accept it would be to become part of the labyrinth, another thread in Kairosphior's tapestry. His purpose was not to understand the equation. His purpose was to solve it. With the last flicker of his will, he uttered his final command. It was not a grand speech or a defiant curse. It was a single binary digit, 0. The command to disengage the containment field. The Weaver and the Cog, locked in their silent, epic battle of wills, were both consumed by the final, irrefutable answer. The anchor of causality was released. For a span of time that could not be measured, because it was the death of measurement itself, the reactor core of the Ordinator Prime ceased to be a process and became a state. The microsecond of frozen time, the perfect, singular moment of is that Coriol's engine seers had so painstakingly crafted, was unleashed into a nexus of pure maybe. It was a drop of absolute, unyielding fact, falling into an ocean of infinite, fluid fiction. The result was not an explosion of energy, but an implosion of possibility. The crystal spire did not shatter, it resolved. The infinite potential realities that Kairosphior had woven together, the endless threads of what if and could be, were all suddenly forced to answer the one question they were never meant to face. Which one of you is true? Faced with the undeniable, singular reality of the anchor, the infinite possibilities could not choose. And so, they all became true at once and for eternity. Across the entire Ouroboros system, the Labyrinth of All-Futures froze. The chaotic, nine-colored dance of the suns halted, their light locking into a single, static, impossible core. The planets stopped in their paradoxical orbits, becoming fixed points in a celestial tableau. On the surface of Anachrona, the war simply stopped. A charging horror of Tzeentch, its mouth open in a cackling scream, was frozen mid-stride, a perfect pink statue of malevolence. A Skitarii ranger, turning to dust under the gaze of a lord of change, was trapped forever in the moment of his dissolution. Half flesh and steel, half swirling motes of ash, a knight, its chainsword inches from a demonic beast's hide, became a permanent monument to a blow that would never land. The entire system, from the outermost comet to the very core of Anachrona, was transmuted. It became a colossal, crystalline sculpture of a single, paradoxical moment of war. The light from the nine suns refracted through the frozen atmosphere, creating a breathtakingly beautiful, utterly silent aurora of shattered time. The landscape was a museum of a battle that was neither won nor lost, a conflict locked in eternal stalemate. The charge of the damned Mechanicus legions, their final, hopeless assault, was now their eternal state, their sacrifice immortalized. They were forever charging, forever dying, and forever defiant. At the heart of it all, within the now solid, translucent crystal spire, the final moments of the two commanders were preserved. The burning, incandescent ruin of the Ordinator Prime was visible, a dark heart within the crystal. And within its command sanctum, two forms could be dimly perceived, locked in their final struggle. The ghostly, multi-limbed shape of Kairosphior, his form dissolving into pure information, was forever entwined with the rigid, metallic silhouette of Archmagos Tristan Gukoriel, his hand raised in his final command. The Weaver and the Cog, the Daemon of infinite possibility and the Mortal of absolute logic, were now inseparable, a permanent centerpiece in the monument to their own war. The victory was, in a way, total. Coriel's gambit had succeeded beyond his wildest calculations. He had not merely defeated the labyrinth, he had imposed a final absolute order upon it. He had taken its infinite chaos and forced it into a single, unchanging state. He had solved the Ouroboros equation with the most definitive answer possible, a full stop. But the cost was equally total. The Crusade of Pure Inquiry was lost. Not a single soul, tech priest or Skitarii, knight or servitor had survived. They had not been killed, they had been eternalized. They were now part of the sculpture, their consciousness trapped in the last microsecond of the battle, doomed to refight a single moment of a war for the rest of time. They had won the war for causality in the system, but in doing so, had sacrificed their own. They were trapped in a prison of their own victory, a victory that was indistinguishable from utter annihilation. The sacrifice of Coriel and his crusade had not saved them. It had merely transmuted them. They had ventured into the labyrinth seeking lost knowledge, and had become a piece of lost history themselves. The living, breathing, dynamic force of the Crusade had been traded for a silent, beautiful, and utterly dead artifact. It was a victory so complete that it was identical to a total defeat. It was a perfectly Tzeentchian outcome, a final, cosmic joke played on the master logician. He had sought to impose a single reality, and in his moment of ultimate success, had only managed to create the labyrinth's most perfect and most permanent work of art. The frozen moment was the ultimate Pyrrhic victory, a war won at the cost of everything, leaving nothing behind but a beautiful, terrible, and silent tomb. From the perspective of the galaxy outside, the event was as baffling and instantaneous as the system's initial disappearance. For the long-range Imperial Navy picket squadrons and rogue trader vessels that patrolled the edge of the quarantine zone, the shimmering, chaotic distortion in space where the Ouroboros system had been simply vanished. One moment, their augur arrays were screaming with impossible readings and contradictory energy signatures. The next, there was only a profound and unnerving silence. The Labyrinth of All-Futures was gone. The first scout probe sent to investigate sent back data that was even more disturbing than the chaos it replaced. Where a star system should have been, there was now a perfect, featureless sphere of blackness. It was not a void in the conventional sense, not an empty patch of space between stars. It was an absence. It reflected no light. It emitted no energy. It had no gravitational pull. It was a wound in the fabric of space-time, a hole in the universe where the laws of physics had simply ceased to apply. Navigators who gazed upon it through their third eye did not see the roiling energies of the warp, but a terrifyingly smooth, placid nothingness that threatened to unravel their sanity. The sphere did not feel empty. It felt null. It was a scar left behind by a battle so fundamental that it had injured reality itself. The astropaths who had once heard the maddening chorus of the labyrinth now heard only a perfect, deafening silence, a silence that spoke of a finality more terrible than any scream. The Adeptus Mechanicus, desperate for news of their lost crusade, dispatched their most advanced explorator vessels. These ships, bristling with esoteric sensors and archaeotech scanners, approached the sphere with extreme caution. Their findings were a litany of impossibilities. Objects that crossed the sphere's event horizon did not reappear. They did not transmit any final data. They simply ceased to be part of the equation of the universe. Time dilation near the edge of the sphere was not just extreme, it was nonsensical. A probe's chronometer would report that it had been traveling for 10,000 years, while the launch vessel's chronometer registered only a few seconds. And a third, independent observation would suggest the probe had never been launched at all. This ontological dead zone became known as the Ouroboros Scar. It was a place of ultimate dread, a cosmic mystery that the Imperium could not solve, and therefore could only fear. The initial hope that the system had somehow been restored was replaced by the grim understanding that it had been annihilated in a way they could not comprehend. All records of the Crusade of Pure Inquiry were sealed by order of the Fabricator General of Mars himself. Archmagos Drastangent Coriol and his entire fleet were listed as perdita, lost in the course of their holy quest, their fate a warning against hubris and the dangers of engaging with the truly unknowable. The shattered front of this bizarre war was not a physical line of retreating ships and broken armies. It was a metaphysical one. Back in the Forge worlds of the Ryza sector, the home of the Lost Crusade, a subtle but profound change began to take place. The machine spirits of the vessels that had been part of the Crusade's initial muster but had remained behind began to act erratically. Cogitators that had once been flawlessly logical would occasionally output streams of paradoxical code. The throne mechanicum of a knight that had been meant to join the crusade but was laid up for repairs began to whisper prophecies of a frozen war to its new pilot. It was as if the ghost of the crusade, its data echo, had returned, but it was corrupted, fractured, tainted by its experience. The most chilling effect was felt by the tech priests, who had been in noospheric contact with the crusade in its earliest stages before it entered the labyrinth. They began to suffer from what the Magos biologists termed causal dissonance. They would experience flashes of memory from events that had never happened. They would find themselves starting a task only to discover they had already completed it yesterday. Some went mad, their minds unable to reconcile their own linear existence with the paradoxical data fragments that had become lodged in their consciousness like shrapnel. They spoke of a silent, beautiful war and an Archmagos who had become a weapon, their ravings dismissed as the babbling of the insane. The war with the labyrinth was over, but its conceptual shrapnel was now scattered across the segmentum, a quiet, insidious infection of the mind. The front had not been broken, it had been dissolved, and its soldiers were now the unsuspecting minds of the very Imperium they had sought to protect. The silence of the Ouroboros Scar was alive. While it presented a face of absolute nullity to the galaxy, its effects began to bleed out, not as a physical invasion, but as a subtle, tempting whisper on the winds of the noosphere. The frozen moment was a perfect prison, but its walls were made of paradox, and paradox, by its nature, is unstable. The catastrophic collision of absolute reality and infinite possibility had created fractures, hairline cracks in the edifice of space-time. Through these cracks, echoes of the Crusade's final desperate struggle and the labyrinth's boundless imagination began to leak. The first signs were dismissed as anomalies, a Magos explorator in a distant system, sifting through stellar phenomena data, found a single, impossible frame of information embedded in the background radiation. It was a partial schematic, impossibly complex, for a reality anchor, a device that could, in theory, stabilize a Geller field with peg% efficiency. The schematic was incomplete, its principles bordered on techno-sorcery, and its existence defied all known laws of physics. The Magos, after weeks of fevered study, declared it a data daemon and purged it with holy fire, but not before the tantalizing possibility of its design had been copied and sent to a dozen of his most trusted colleagues for analysis. Months later, on the Forge world of Griffin IV, a datasmith was conducting a deep-level diagnostic on a Legion Cybernetica Castellan robot. Deep within its core programming, nestled between standard combat protocols, He found a new, unauthorized subroutine. It was a string of perfect, elegant code that allowed the robot to calculate the probable future movements of an enemy with a staggering 98% accuracy. The code was beautiful, a work of art, but its logic was circular, referencing outcomes to predict actions. It was a piece of temporal paradox, encoded as a combat algorithm. The discovery caused a quiet but furious schism within the Legion Cybernetica. Some saw it as a heretical anomaly, a scrap of warp code to be eradicated. Others saw it as a miracle of the omniscia, a glimpse into a higher form of sacred machine logic. These whispers of a new war were not threats of armies and fleets, but of knowledge. The war was no longer for territory, but for the soul of the Adeptus Mechanicus itself. The data fragments leaking from the scar were the ultimate temptation. Solutions to impossible problems, fragments of STCs that promised to revolutionize Imperial technology, blueprints for weapons that could bend the laws of physics. Each fragment was a seed of heresy, promising immense power but demanding a small, seemingly insignificant compromise of doctrinal purity. The fragments became known among secretive circles of tech priests as Coriol's Folly, or more reverently, the Frozen Canticles. They were a new, insidious form of chaotic corruption, not the overt, flesh-twisting madness of Slaanesh or the bloodthirsty rage of Khorne, but a quiet, intellectual poison. It was the lure of the shortcut, the appeal of the elegant but impossible solution. It preyed on the very core of the Mechanicus identity, their insatiable quest for knowledge. To ignore these fragments was to deny their creed. To study them was to invite damnation. A cult began to form, a secret society of Magi known as the Logicians of the Unfound Postulate. They believed that the Ouroboros scar was not a tomb, but a library. They saw Dristangian Ku Coriol not as a tragic martyr, but as a transcendent being who had sacrificed himself to create the ultimate repository of knowledge. They began to actively seek out the Frozen Canticles, piecing together the impossible technologies they described. They built small, unstable devices in hidden laboratories, chronotors that could view a few seconds into the past, power cells that drew energy from causality itself, and targeting systems that aimed at probabilities rather than physical objects. Their technology was miraculous, but it was also deeply wrong, and with every successful experiment, the line between divine engineering and techno-sorcery grew thinner until it vanished entirely. The whispers from the scar were setting the stage for a new conflict. A civil war of belief within the heart of the cult Mechanicus. A war between the dogma of the past and the seductive, terrifying possibilities of a new, heretical future. The whispers did not go unheard by the masters of the Imperium. While the Adeptus Mechanicus wrestled with the philosophical and technological ramifications of the Frozen Canticles, the esoteric guardians of humanity sensed a more fundamental threat. In the silent chambers of Titan, the Grey Knights felt a cold stillness in the warp, where there had once been a raging storm, a calm that was more menacing than the tempest it replaced. On Holy Terra, the astropathic choirs reported a new kind of interference, not a scream or a roar, but a subtle, pervasive harmonic of pure paradox that made their minds ache and their prophecies unreliable. Most acutely, the Ordo Malleus, the eternal watchers for demonic threats of the highest order, recognized the Ouroboros scar for what it was, a new and unprecedented form of chaotic incursion. This was not an eye of terror, a roaring gateway for legions of daemons. It was something far more insidious. It was a conceptual plague, an attack not on the body of the Imperium, but on its mind. Specifically, the rigidly logical mind of the Adeptus Mechanicus. An Inquisitor Lord of the Ordo Malleus, the ancient and formidable Hector Rex, convened a secret conclave. He presented his findings, compiled from the frantic reports of astropaths, the divinations of Imperial Tarot, and the tortured confessions of tech priests who had dabbled in the Frozen Canticles. "We face a heresy of the equation," Rex declared, his voice a low growl that filled the darkened chamber. "For millennia, the archenemy has tempted us with power, with pleasure, with rage. Now it tempts our most vital servants with a far more potent lure, a perfect, undeniable answer. The Ouroboros scar is not a beachhead for an army. It is a poisoned well of knowledge from which the cult Mechanicus is already drinking. The decision of the conclave was unanimous and absolute. The threat was too subtle, too fundamental to be met with fleets and armies. A conventional crusade would be useless against an enemy that was an idea. What was required was not a war, but a quarantine of body, of mind, and of soul. By the highest authority of the High Lords of Terra, the entire sector containing the Ouroboros Scar, along with the two adjacent sectors, was declared Sector Purgatus. The designation was one of the most extreme in the Imperium's arsenal. All warp travel into or out of the area was forbidden on pain of death. All astropathic communication was to be jammed, creating a 3-sector-wide zone of absolute silence. All worlds within this zone were to be isolated, their populations left to their fate, their tides forgotten. It was an act of cosmic surgery, excising a vast swath of the Imperium to prevent a conceptual cancer from spreading. To enforce this grand quarantine, a force of unparalleled vigilance was assembled. A permanent fleet of the Imperial Navy's most disciplined captains was assigned to the blockade. Their order simple: destroy any vessel attempting to enter or leave the Purgatus Zone, regardless of allegiance. But the true guardians were not the Navy. A full brotherhood of Grey Knights, the Sarmored Brotherhood, the Wardens of the Scar, was permanently stationed on a newly constructed fortress monastery on the sector's edge. Their task was not to fight daemons in the conventional sense, but to hunt for the conceptual incursions, the whispers of forbidden knowledge that might slip through the blockade. Chamber Militant of the Ordo Malleus, the Grey Knights were joined by the Silent Sisters of the Adeptus Sororitas' Order of the Argent Shroud, their faith a bulwark against the subtle temptations of paradox. They patrolled the quarantine line, their vessels running silent, their purpose grim. They boarded ships in the surrounding sectors, their stormbolters ready, but their true weapons were the purity seals on their armor and the unshakable faith in their hearts. They were not looking for mutants or heretics. They were looking for tech priests with haunted eyes, for ships whose machine spirits hummed with an unnatural logic, for cogitators that whispered elegant, impossible truths. The scouring was brutal and quiet. The cult of the logicians of the unfound postulate was hunted down and exterminated with cold, merciless efficiency. Forge worlds suspected of harboring their research were placed under interdict, their magi subjected to rigorous and often fatal inquisitorial examination. Entire libraries of data slates were incinerated, not for containing overt heresy, but for containing equations that were deemed ontologically unsound. The Ordo Malleus was not just fighting a cult, it was performing an intellectual purge, attempting to erase a dangerous idea from the memory of the Imperium. For millennia, the quarantine held, the Ouroboros Scar became a place of myth and legend, a blank space on galactic maps that navigators feared more than the Maelstrom or the Eye of Terror. The Wardens of the Scar stood their silent vigil, a generational duty passed down from one battle brother to the next. They became the silent, eternal jailers of a dead star system. Their war a quiet, endless struggle against the seductive promise of a perfect answer. The grand, galaxy-shaking war of the Labyrinth of All-Futures had ended, and in its place was a cold, silent, and unending police action, a testament to the Imperium's ultimate solution to that which it could not understand: to cage it, to silence it, and to stand guard over it forever. In the great silent calculus of the galaxy, the Crusade of Pure Inquiry was a number rounded down to 0. The Ouroboros Scar became a permanent fixture of Segmentum Tempestus, a constant, silent reminder of a war that was too strange to be remembered. Its legacy was not one of glorious battle or tragic defeat, but of a profound and unnerving quiet. The quarantine held, a testament to the Imperium's grim determination to excise its own mysteries. The sacrifice of Archmagos Coriol and his legions did not earn them eternal glory, but eternal silence. They became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered only in the highest echelons of the Mechanicus and the Ordo Malleus, a lesson on the dire cost of absolute knowledge. The balance of power in the region shifted, not through conquest but through absence. The sectors declared Purgatus withered on the vine, worlds starved, cut off from imperial trade. Entire subsectors fell to Xenos raids or internal collapse, their desperate pleas for aid lost in the enforced astropathic silence. The Imperium had cauterized its own limb to save the body, leaving billions to die in the dark, a necessary and unlamented cost of maintaining doctrinal purity. The legacy of the Crusade was a vast swath of dead space, both in the void and in the memory of mankind. Yet, from the perspective of the great conspirator, the outcome was nothing short of a masterpiece. Within the frozen heart of the Ouroboros Scar, Kairosphior was not dead, nor was he defeated. He was imprisoned, yes, but his prison was a monument of his own design, an eternal testament to the sublime power of Tzeentch. He had been locked in an eternal struggle with the mind of Drystangen Ku Coriol, a battle of infinite possibility versus absolute logic that would never end. This was not a punishment. It was a state of divine contemplation, an endless, fascinating game against the most worthy opponent the daemon had ever encountered. The true victory, the grander scheme, was far more subtle and far-reaching. The initial goal had never been the mere destruction of a Mechanicus crusade or the conquest of a single star system. That was a game for lesser gods, for brutes like Khorne or hedonists like Slaanesh. Tzeentch's ambition was the corruption of a concept, and in this, Kairosphior had succeeded beyond his most elaborate predictions. The Crusade of Pure Inquiry had been the perfect instrument. It was the purest distillation of the Adeptus Mechanicus creed, an army of unflinching logicians and seekers of knowledge. By confronting them with the Labyrinth, Kairosphior had not just destroyed them, he had forced their philosophy to its breaking point and beyond. He had proven that their quest for a single, quantifiable truth was a fool's errand in a universe of infinite possibility. The frozen canticles, the tempting whispers of impossible technology that now haunted the fringes of the Mechanicus, were the true legacy of the war. Kairosphior had not needed to conquer the Forge Worlds. He had planted a seed of doubt, a virus of logic that would do his work for him. The Adeptus Mechanicus was now forever divided between the rigid dogma that had always defined it and the tantalizing, heretical promise of a higher understanding. This schism would fester for millennia, a slow-burning civil war of ideas that was far more damaging than any open conflict. Every new technological advance would be suspect, every brilliant discovery a potential gateway to damnation. The quest for knowledge, the very soul of the Mechanicus, was now inextricably linked with the path to heresy. This was the ninth canticle of Tzeentch, the final beautiful movement in Kairosphior's symphony. The Labyrinth of All-Futures was gone, its purpose served. The Mechanicus crusade was not merely destroyed, it had been transmuted. Its faith, its logic, and its very identity had been reforged into an eternal, self-sustaining trap for its own kind. The Ouroboros scar was not a tomb, it was a beacon, broadcasting a silent, irresistible song of heresy to those intelligent enough to listen. The war had not ended with the frozen moment. It had simply evolved into a more elegant, more patient, and far more terrible form. The grand scheme, the slow and certain corruption of pure reason itself, had only just begun.